everybody because of where I'm coming from. So it's like the voice of God chiming in. Yes,
That's what I
bots.
always do anyway.
Okay.
Okay, and then let me make this bigger. And then I'll do speaker view. Oh, how come that makes? Oh, speaker view. Oh, it's because.
Because I'm not, what if I start speaking? No, still Laura.
Why is it still Laura even if I do speaker view?
Because there's only two of us. I can fix that.
Okay,
Okay. I'm gonna have us read a parable first. So I don't know if you want.
well, these are really handy because this is the whole
Perfect,
gospel. of
perfect,
Matthew.
perfect,
That's what I've been
perfect.
handing out.
Yeah,
every
great.
week,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I pray that our conversation about the parables is, meaningful and
You know, it's not the number of people here.
inspired.
I felt like last week, I felt like what? Is that something I need to do? It just says.
No, that was my my co-host thing joining so that we'll have more than two people.
Oh, okay. I just need to close this thing then. I can. Let me X that X. There.
Okay.
I'm supposed to be in like 5 places today at one time
Oh,
because
goodness.
I'm also supposed to help Bob with announcements, but I think that's not till 10:30, right?
I thought it was at both of them, but
I think it's because of the Zoom thing that I'm supposed to help him.
I thought it was because he didn't know our area, he wasn't. You know what? He'll be fine. Somebody will help him. He'll be good.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, just kind of an introduction to parables in general. For anybody that's here, or maybe we can supply these documents digitally, or you can just search online. The parables are found in the 3 synoptic gospels. So John doesn't have parables. And what I prepared for people here is a list of the parables and where there's overlap and where there's not, which is kind of helpful to look at. And it's interesting because the evangelists have different audiences. And so there might be a little bit of tweaking or consideration we give to who were they addressing? Like, was it a group of Jewish people? Was it Gentiles converted? Or like Luke's was Greco-Roman. So they're going to probably tailor a little bit to their audience. And let's see, Luke has, I believe, the most parables, followed by Matthew and then Mark. And as we've kind of discussed before, most scholars believe Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark and this document called Q, which they've kind of, I thought was interesting, pieced together what they think was in Q. So I would love to see that.
Wasn't Q the boss of 007?
I don't know.
I don't know. I think so.
Yeah. But, so it blows my mind what people have studied and learned. It's incredible. And so they've kind of looked at these 3 synoptic gospels and figured out where are the commonalities, and therefore, I guess, deduced what must have been Q, Mark, and then Matthew supposedly had those plus a different document, and Luke had those 2 plus a different document. And John kind of does a different thing entirely. So we've got these parables, and parables were not unique to Jesus. The Jewish people had been telling parables long before Jesus' time. So if you've got a Jewish audience, they're very familiar with this format, and they're familiar even with some of the content, like Jesus might sort of twist one that they might be really familiar with. So those are just some things that are kind of interesting to think about. And Jesus tells parables to cause us to respond. So he uses really ordinary circumstances, which might not seem so ordinary to us, because vineyards and fig trees and so forth isn't necessarily our reality in an urban area or suburban area, but it would have been for the audiences. And yet the endings are not what they might expect. And that's the whole point. And it's less about what exactly did it mean as how are you going to respond to this? And I found, I brought 3 of the books I'm using. I'm taking a parables class. And they sometimes agree and sometimes disagree. But what I find is when you read about the parables, the different scholars are more in agreement about what they think it doesn't mean than what they think it does mean. I know. And one of the things they warn us against is allegorizing. So if you need to make up a key, like this stands for that, and this stands for that, and this stands for that, that's probably
missing the point.
Yeah, because if Jesus, a couple times Jesus kind of gives a key, but a lot of times he doesn't. So if he doesn't give it, then we can't assume. And then the other thing we tend to do that we have to be careful of is we tend to anachronize. So we want to put our world and our reality in the parable, and we can do that for our interpretation or what does it mean for our life, but we can't. It's not today. It was written in a different context.
It wasn't 21st century America.
Right. So we have to be mindful. With that said, I couldn't help. We're going to talk about the day laborers thinking about contract workers today, because that's what it seems like to me. But we have to be really careful. So those were a couple of just general things that I wanted to share. So I thought we'd start maybe by looking at the parable of the day laborers, which is Matthew 20, 1 through 16. So Joyce, do you want to read that? And then we can just kind of familiarize ourselves and anybody listening.
Okay, so it's Matthew 21 through 16.
Yes.
So one of the nice and also difficult things about this particular format that I'm using,
You don't have the
verse numbers.
Okay.
So I think I can figure out where that ends,
right.
okay?
Yeah.
But if it goes farther, you can just tell me keep reading.
Yeah.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for a day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last only worked 1 hour," they said, "and you've made them equal to us who've borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered to them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money?" Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last.
Okay. So I would just like, what are your initial, like, what sticks out, or what would be your initial?
You know, my first thought is, I hope I didn't get hired till 5 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Then I get the most for my money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And yeah,
Yeah, your wage goes up dramatically, hourly wage
right,
anyways.
right,
It
right.
really does, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I am totally with the people who were hired first, like,
Mhm.
but it doesn't seem fair,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I
Yeah.
get that.
Yeah. What do you think about this landowner?
Well, I don't know. I think he's right. He has the right to pay them. He set the wage.
Mhm.
He can pay them. And he says, don't I have are you envious because I'm so generous? Well, what they're thinking probably is, well, you were generous with those people who
Mhm.
came late in the day, but you're not being that generous with us.
Mhm.
And why is that? So, yeah.
Interesting. It's and again, reading about this one, there's more agreements what it's not, and I will share some of that convoluted things. Well, okay, I shouldn't have put my own word in there. The interpretations that people have come up with, which I just think kind of fit in that category of be careful, because that might be 3 steps further than what we have in now. But just a couple of things, like they say that in Greek, the word landowner is actually not landowner, it's householder. So all that means is, in this time period, a household was an extended family, and it was a both productive and consumption unit. So it was, in a sense, its own little. So this landowner, it's not a super wealthy landowner.
More of a family
It's
farm.
more of a, yes, it's more of an
Oh,
extended
that makes sense.
family. So this person is not uber wealthy. And we need to be keeping in mind, he's not really a capitalist, because he's not concerned about his bottom line, because he could get away with less.
Right.
So he's not just like trying to maximize that bottom line. Nor does he seem particularly intentional about his hiring practices. Like, if you are a business person, you're probably going to be more aware of what your needs are. Like, why is he taking the time, which is kind of inefficient, to keep going into that marketplace and bringing people back each time, rather than thinking, I've got X amount of work that's got to get done, unless the people weren't there at the beginning of the day. And we really don't see evidence that there weren't plenty he could have hired at the beginning of the day. So if he knew, I need 20 workers, he could have just hired 20 people.
Yeah, and he at one point says, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?
Yeah,
And so it's like,
yeah.
well, if they were there all day, why didn't you hire them earlier
Right.
in the day?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Were the vines fuller than he realized? Who
And
knows?
yeah,
You know?
but he goes back not
I
just
know.
once, he goes back
Multiple
several
times, right.
Yeah. Which kind of his coming and going, one of the maybe stretched interpretations is that those comings and goings represent historical eras.
Oh, that's kind of reading a lot into
Yeah,
it.
so
Yeah.
one from did I jot it down? I might not have even bothered jotting it down, but one is like from creation to Noah, one is like Noah to Abraham, so it's got kind of Christian history divided into however many groupings that they have them going. So probably not. And some people like to wonder, well, are those last hired somehow inferior? But we don't really have that said either. And people are like, well, what is the value of a denarius? So what wage are we talking about?
I don't think that matters, does it?
Okay. Well,
I mean, because it's just, I mean, like in our thinking, you know, it could be, I'll pay you $100 a day. It's still the same thing if the person who comes at 5 o'clock gets $100 and the person who started at 7 a.m. gets $100. So,
yeah.
so in a sense, it doesn't really matter what a denarius is, I think.
Unless you want to focus in on, is the head of the household generous or not? Because if he was truly generous, almost like those scrumblers, well, why didn't he be generous with us? And is a denarius a generous wage? Which it's not overly. They said poverty level at that time would be 200 denarius a year. So it was the going wage. It would, you know, it was the going, it was exactly, you know, and the grumblers, I mean, it was hot. It was hard work. So the all day thing.
Oh, I would be totally with the grumblers.
Mhm.
Wouldn't you? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
wouldn't you feel like,
Oh,
I think
I'm hot, I'm tired,
Oh,
and I know
totally.
this is what you said you're gonna pay me, but come on, man, you paid
Yeah.
this guy that was only here for
Right.
an hour, the same
Right.
amount.
oh, yeah.
And he chose to pay the last ones. So he he could have, if the landowner or householder just wanted to be generous with the last group, he could have paid them last, and the grumbling early workers wouldn't know. And so there's a piece there. And I think to pick up on, we're with the grumblers. Absolutely. And so that's probably where this is talking to us. It's like, you know, we are so prone to look side to side rather than, you know, the householder says, this is what you agreed to. This is the going wage. You did it. You know, like sometimes I think about, and not really, but as a working woman, when I started a job, there was no part-time options. There was no paternity leave. My husband, when my water broke, was going to go up to school to get his lesson plan. I mean, and there was no time out. He was like, literally, he was home with me a day and then he was back at work the next day. And the job I had before I went into teaching, it was 2 weeks, 2 weeks when you had a baby, and then you were supposed to come back full time. I mean, and so sometimes I think, wow, well, what might have my career been like if I didn't really need to make a decision like I did, because there was just no reasonable option if you wanted to be a parent. And so sometimes, you know, but I'm thankful for my daughter, for my daughter-in-law, all these women now, because it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But sometimes you feel like,
Well, and I think that that's the thing, you know, it's easy to say, well, if I had to do it, other people should have to do it.
Right.
Rather than say, isn't this great that they have these opportunities that I didn't have? And I mean, I've always thought that with like fraternity hazing or I think that with medical training, where doctors will say, well, I had to have the, you know, 48 hours straight with no break. So these new people coming up should have to do that too. Instead of saying, you know, that was never a good idea.
Right.
That wasn't safe for anybody.
Right.
So let's do something reasonable. A lot of it is like, if I had to do it, everybody, you know, if I'm suffering, everybody should suffer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's totally in our human nature. And I taught economics, and I would I've always really read about gravitated to behavioral economics, which looks at how we respond to things, because I like psychology too. And they did studies that showed that if you asked somebody, would you rather have an $80,000 annual income or a $100,000 annual income? It makes no sense to choose the smaller amount, right?
Right.
It is what it is, no change in cost of living. But if you said, okay, you're going to earn 80, but the people around you are going to have an average wage of 60.
Then you're happy.
Or if you're going to earn 100, the people around you are all earning 120. Then people actually say they'd rather have $80,000 income, which means they can buy less, take fewer trips, do whatever. But that's our human nature, because we're such people of comparison, such people of comparison.
And I think even when we try not to be, it's really hard. I mean, if you think of children playing, one of the things you hear a lot is, but that's not fair.
Right.
Right. And I mean, it's like from our earliest time, we're kind of like comparing, is this person getting what I'm getting? Are they, treated the same as I'm being treated? And
right.
And
right. And you think about clothes they wear. That's why sometimes school uniforms can be really nice, because it takes out some of that stuff.
Except then they find other ways, like
right,
what shoes they wear, or what purse they will carry,
It
or what.
totally is. It totally is.
They always find some way around that.
You got to, yeah. So there's definitely that piece. So one of the interpretations that I read, and this makes sense to me, is this parable was said very much with the disciples in mind. And that last line you read, so the last will be first and the first will be last, is a little bit of a kind of an attachment. And so they're not really sure if Jesus said that or if that was added in when it was written. But if I'm not mistaken, there are conversations between Jesus and the disciples about which one of us is going to be kind of the most honored and who gets to sit by you. And Jesus, in a lot of ways, is kind of, in addition to speaking to all of us, but he's talking to the disciples too, like, stop it. Stop trying to think about which one of you is going to be better treated or not. So that's kind of, it's an attitude check for all. And so kind of coming down at the end, it seems like it's about envy, greed, and generosity. And our tendencies to be envious are the householder not being greedy as he could have been, but rather being generous. And yet you have to be kind of careful comparing him to God, because he's not overly generous. It's not as generous. For example, the parable where the debt is forgiven. The original, when the king forgives somebody's debt, that person had in real terms of the time was almost like forgiving our national debt. It was beyond huge.
Yeah.
That's much more likely an example of God's generosity than the denarius given to everybody.
Right.
So it's a little bit of what's our attitude, both in, are we happy for other people, and are we willing to be generous? And so that's kind of, and the householder, they do have means compared to the day laborers.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So it is a little bit of a call. If you are able, are you willing to be helpful?
Mhm.
And to be helpful to ensure that people have their needs met. I mean, this denarius a day is not making anybody rich, but it is making sure they're fed.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our situations, we're probably more like the landowner
Mhm.
than the day worker,
Mhm.
Oh, for sure,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah. And I tried to think about like, where should I be more generous, or where am I not thinking about my generosity? So it's definitely food for thought, food. Because like I said, the wage is just making sure somebody has food.
Mhm.
I've always felt very kind of drawn and compelled towards the food pantry.
Mhm.
Somehow the feeding thing, I don't know if it's because I like to cook or whatever, it gets me. School lunches,
Well, I think
and
feeling
things.
like people
it's
need those
just-
basic needs.
Yes.
You know, like if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, you
Right,
want them
you
to have
can't even, yeah,
shelter, you want them to have food, you know.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
right.
the other stuff's important, but that's not gonna happen unless you have those
right,
basics.
Right,
Mhm.
and it's not surprising either. There are feeding miracles surrounding this parable too. So,
Hmm.
God provides, but if we've been given resources, it becomes our responsibility to provide and direct too. So kind of yeah. And the other thing is, we don't know anything about these workers. And you still have a wealthier household. You still have the poor. And so it's not a situation where all are equal at the end of the parable. It's more,
So what do you make of the last will be first and the first will
well,
be last?
that's like I said, that line, they're not sure if that was an add-in, almost like.
Although it appears also right before this. Where did I see that? I just saw that somewhere. Now, of course, I don't know where it was, but
Yeah,
well,
and
it's a sentence right before. That Jesus said to them, truly, I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who's left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit in eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first.
It would be interesting to look. All right, so I'm not directly answering. My take and what I read was, again, that somehow this connected to the disciples grumbling about who was going to be first and last. And I
Right.
don't see exactly in Matthew, but I'm wondering if we looked at Luke's rendition of this one or Mark's rendition, where the placement is. Because one thing, these parables, even when they're in 2 or 3 of the gospels, they aren't necessarily in the same
order,
place.
right?
Mm.
Yeah.
And so it's probably in one of the other 2.
Well, I noticed Matthew 18, which isn't too far before this.
Mhm.
At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest
There,
in the kingdom of
okay,
heaven?
so that's, yes. And that's what I read was
Mhm.
probably he's speaking to the disciples there. Like, remember we had that conversation a while ago here. It's,
Yeah.
and
And you might be the person who was here early and worked all day and
Mhm.
and sweated and did a lot of toil, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're the first,
Right,
you know,
right.
which speaks to our, but it's not fair kind of response.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm kind of just thinking in my mind about the story of Lazarus, or is it Lazarus? Where the person is wealthy on earth and then
Oh,
they're
yeah.
kind of, which is always a troublesome thing,
Mhm.
reaching up from the furnace. And you know, it's like maybe a call also, be mindful, this isn't all there is, and hoarding our resources
Mhm.
is not really accomplishing not what we should be focused on. So yeah,
Yeah,
there's always, and like I said, when we hear the parables, the purpose is we're supposed to respond.
Mm.
but I think they always, to me, also leave me kind of asking questions, which is
Mhm.
not necessarily a bad thing.
No. Mm-mm.
Like, oh, well. And I guess that is part of the response, like,
Right, yeah.
yeah, what do I do?
Right, exactly,
How does
And-
that affect how I'm gonna live my life?
right.
Mm. Mhm.
And should I just kind of be aware of my feeling? I mean,
Mhm.
it is human nature to see the seeming injustice or the grumbling. So it's just a call to see when we might try to let our grumbling go.
Yeah.
You know, I used to say to my kids, try to look up, and I tell myself, try to look up, not side to side, because I can
Mhm.
find a lot to be frustrated with.
Yeah.
And especially, you know, in school settings. I was a teacher, my kids, obviously, I was a student. So it's so prevalent there. There's always somebody who's that, or somebody that, you know,
Oh, yeah.
it just is so in your face. So, yeah.
Do you guys know where the front desk is, or where I can drop off the food?
The food, is this food for, I think that
Yeah,
the
I just go
table's up
outside.
there.
I just go outside.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
Hey, no worries. Yeah, so. Thought that was a little bit of a start anyways with that. And I don't know, do you want us to look at a different one? Sure. For a few minutes? The other one I pulled out, is the parable of the two sons. So this is Matthew 21, 28 through 32. So is that going to be hard to find in here? Let's see.
Well, I don't think so, because I think,
Is it in gray when he's speaking? So maybe,
well, these are usually the readings, but I
yeah,
think,
and it was a few weeks
Yeah.
ago.
yeah. So I think
Oh,
it's
it's not-
probably, it probably, does it start, what do you think?
Start with, if you would read, starting with Jesus entered the temple courts, and then it stopped.
Yeah, and then I can
stops
see where
with
it is.
listen to
Yeah,
another,
right.
yeah.
Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. And who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? And if we say of human origin, we're afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first and said, son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered, but later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and did the same thing. He answered, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the two did what his father wanted? The first, they answered. Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him.
Okay,
Gonna close the store.
yeah. So what sticks out with this one? With initial reading or hearing?
Well, it seems like it's not so much what you say, but what you do. Like,
Okay.
it's kind of, you know, actions speak louder than words.
Mhm, mhm. It's, and you know, the actual part about the two sons kind of comes towards the end.
Right.
I thought it was interesting. You've got Jesus teaching in the temples, and Jesus avoided, he did not like to be in that situation because he knew the Pharisees, the scribes, the elders, they were gonna just look, they're just looking to trip him up. They're just,
Mhm.
you know, they just have kind of ill will at heart. And I just, as a mom, laughed at the idea that, you know, they question him and you know, they've got this plan, not as a mom, that part, but, and what Jesus does, he doesn't answer him. He turns around and asks them a question. I
Mhm.
just kept thinking about, you know, how many times is the subject changed because you don't want to confront whatever it is. And obviously Jesus, you know, has full reasons for doing this, but I couldn't help see the humanity, like, I don't really want to answer that question. Let me turn this right back around to you because you're trying, in their question, they were not sincere.
No,
Jesus would answer a sincere question.
yeah,
He's like, you're just trying, so let me create the same scenario for you. And, you know, in which case it's like, oh, okay. All right.
yeah.
So part of me kind of laughs at Jesus' approach there. Very wise. And then he goes on to the two sons. So yeah, and one of the things in this era of, you know, the Roman Empire is honor was hugely important throughout the culture. So not just for Jewish people, not just for, you know, followers of Jesus, not just for Greeks and Romans, for all of them, like honor was a big deal. So, you know, when Jesus is asking kind of, it's which one is honoring the Father? The one who says, oh yes, and then, you know, gets busy doing something else and doesn't bother. Well, I think we're pretty clear, and even the Pharisees answer, well, that's not honorable because you're not keeping your word, you're not doing your but if you look at the second son who says no, and then eventually maybe feels guilty and comes around to doing it, the response no is not very honorable either. You know, it's kind of like talking back, or it's just in the code of honor and shame. Neither one of those is a very honorable response. I kind of thought, you know, like you said, the ultimate question is it more important what we say or what we do? I couldn't help but think of take that, and this is extending it, but all right, is it, you know, if you think about the question, what gives us like eternal life, or what brings us into that Christian name? Is it saying I'm a Christian? is it doing things that Jesus would want me to do? So is it like what we say or what we do is like,
Well, it's
oh,
the, you know, faith or
our works.
works, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and I was raised Lutheran, and Martin Luther was really clear. And yet, you know, you've got James who says faith without works is dead.
Yeah, and you know, by your works that you know them,
Right.
you know, so. And I think so I think actually the answer to that question is similar to Jesus's answer here, which is, well, let me ask you another question.
Yeah. Right. Right.
You know, it's like you're asking something where there isn't one right answer, and yet you're wanting one right answer.
Mhm.
And it's like your faith should transform your actions.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think ultimately that, you know, maybe that's the question. Like, am I saying I'm Christian, part of this group, but not really following through what Jesus would ask?
I think of this all the time because my years and years ago, this is like over 40 years ago, I went with my sister when they were looking at a house that was for sale by owner that they ended up buying. But the owner was, I think he was Christian reformed, so you know, very reformed kind of view of things. But when they were talking about like Christian faith, he said, well, you know, are you the kind that, do you confess or profess? And she said, well, profess, I hope, thinking she wanted to tell other people. And it was clear from his response that she had the wrong answer. But we're quite sure still 40 years later.
Like, what exactly
what was he getting at between confess and profess?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
But that's what's interesting about different groups. Like you said, you were raised Lutheran, you know, everybody has their own kind of little in language and in way of expressing their faith and
right.
You're only one person. You're only one person.
Yeah, we're a small group today.
Very small.
Small but mighty, Bethy.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I think it's a call almost to churches too, to kind of be discipling people, either because you get extremes. And you know, I think there are churches that are all about kind of what you say, but then they maybe need to be really mindful about taking people and maybe pushing them. Okay, here's what you say, so what's that going to look like? And then you might have the other situation where people are doing or trying to check off a box or whatever, and kind of be, maybe those folks need to say, look, this is great things, but think about who are you serving? Where is your heart? Is this something you're doing kind of to check that box, or is it for self-gratitude? I mean, we see a lot of people who want to do things and they want everybody to know about it. As opposed to, that was one thing that I learned about, I think reading about this one in Judaism, because Jesus was Jewish, and you know, there's the Jewish culture. And I love, if anybody isn't familiar with Amy Jill Levine, she's a Jewish rabbi who teaches at Vanderbilt. And it's so helpful to read her words because she's very reverent, but she understands Judaism. And so she can very much speak into what Jesus is saying as a Jew. And Judaism has something called a mitzvah, which is where, you know, part of the Jewish law is you're supposed to treat others like, right, love others as God loved us. And a mitzvah is when you do that, but the ultimate mitzvah is when you do it where the person cannot repay you.
Respond. Mhm.
Yeah. And she used the example in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which bummer, it's only in Luke. Because we could have talked about it.
Yeah.
But if that's a familiar parable, the person is wounded on the side of the road.
Mhm.
And some people say, well, you got to give the religious authorities or the very devout Jewish people that passed by a break because it's defiling to touch a dead body. So
Mhm.
if that person was dead,
Mhm.
they would be defiling, and that's breaking the law. And so
Mhm.
that's not good. And so you have to be mindful. That might be why they pass them by.
Mhm.
To which you'd say, well, they didn't go see if they were dead.
Mhm.
And then she said, in Judaism, if there's a dead corpse and there's no appropriate way, what the person should do is bury that person. And that's the ultimate mitzvah, because you don't just leave a corpse.
Mhm.
And what you've done now is a deed of service that cannot be repaid.
Mhm.
So that's the ultimate. You're serving and doing things for others that will not, it's not at all self-serving.
Mhm.
And so there's kind of that piece too. When we're serving, when we're doing these works that hopefully fruits of the Spirit are we doing it for the glory and honor of God? Or is it kind of like, well, I'm kind of hoping I get some acclaim for this, or,
Mhm.
so, but I thought it was interesting when we had this parable, the two sons, was the reading a few weeks ago. And with that, this was the gospel reading. The epistle reading for the day was, did I write it down? It was when, see if I wrote, yeah, it was Philippians 2, 1 through 13, where Jesus, it's being talked about how Jesus did not consider equality with the Father as something to be grasped, but laid down his life in obedience and service to all. So death on a cross. And I thought, interesting, if this culturally is about honor,
Mhm.
the epistle reading is the ultimate honor. Jesus is God.
Mhm.
Jesus is God. And yet he comes to earth, he takes on human form and emotion and pain and hunger and all of that. And ultimately died. I mean, he's humiliated. He doesn't come down. I mean, wouldn't it be human nature to say, do you know who I am?
Yeah, right.
I mean, how many times do you hear
Right.
stories of somebody who's like, do you know who I am? As
Right.
if they should be treated.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, Jesus could pull up, do you know who I am? And he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He gets up on that cross. And so the ultimate honor is that. And neither of these sons is completely honorable, because one says he's gonna and doesn't, and the other shames the father when he says no. I mean, like, I don't need to do what you're asking me.
Well, I'm married to somebody who probably once a week, if I make a request, will say no, and then he'll say, I'm like the son who says I won't, but then I go with. So this parable gets a lot of airtime in our house. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. So,
And I gotta say, I prefer the son, I prefer the son who says no, but does it. Which is interesting, because a lot of times people just want to hear the yes, whatever
Yeah.
you want.
right.
And but if it's not followed by action, it's
Right.
meaningless.
Right, right. You know, and it's hot, and I thought about, oh, well, is the second son doing it because he's got a guilt trip? And what does that mean? But there are some times too where I think the Holy Spirit works in our lives that way. Like, we might just not really be inclined initially because we're human and, you know, I really don't want to do that. And then the more you think about it, you're like, you kind of get tugged. I mean, nudged. I mean,
Yeah,
I think there's some of that. And that doesn't make it
Yeah.
right,
yeah.
but
But then the other one seems like to me like, remember Leave It to Beaver and Eddie Haskell, who was always like,
yeah,
and that's Mrs. Cleaver, and then he'd go do devious things behind her back.
Right.
And there's that kind of feeling of, you know, oh yes, I'll do that, father, you know, and then behind his back.
right, right. Yeah, exactly. And I think when you look at both of the sons in context and the question of faith, it's yes, and it's not either or.
Mhm.
So it's what we say and what we do. Are we obedient? Because God wants us to be obedient. So
Mhm.
you're saying, yeah, but are we productive as well?
Mhm.
And I think you see that in a lot of these parables, is that idea of both obedience and productivity. I mean, it's not okay to just retreat
Mhm.
into your little shell.
So faith and works.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So yeah. So there's so much there,
Yeah.
and we got a whole big list of
Yeah, can I
Parables.
look at that list?
yeah, I made copies over
Oh,
there.
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
I'll grab one.
Yeah, it's because it's really interesting.
Yeah. No, I found that.
Yeah,
I like that.
and there are slight deviations. And there are some words that do have meanings. Like I said, we have to be careful not to allegorize, like if there's not a key, don't make one. But the word vineyard, I think, is pretty much accepted to be Israel. You can read vineyard as Israel, which is interesting. This guy's not a, well, I guess they didn't call him a vineyard owner. They called him a landowner. But yeah. And like I said, it's interesting. If Mark was written first, he's got some, and then where Luke and Matthew go, how they may change order, how may they change wording a little bit.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. So good.
So in your parables class, you said you're mostly looking at Luke, or?
Well, it had been that way up till now.
Uh-huh.
We're starting to branch. But like I said, I felt like I had read a lot on the Good Samaritan. So I was
Yeah,
like, all of
right.
a sudden I'm like, oh, yeah, that's
Oh,
just in Luke.
Yeah.
Which, you know, part of me is like, well, I don't, if Luke was a physician, is that, you know, who knows?
Yeah. When I thought of the Good Samaritans today, because I read something on Facebook that I thought was really sweet. It was a woman who said she's Jewish and her next door neighbor is Palestinian ethnicity, Muslim. And she talked about taking a meal over to her and them sharing stories and talking about how, you know, we need to be getting together and sharing those stories. And it made me think of the Good Samaritan because of going to the person who, you know, isn't one of us, you know,
right.
The other,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And thinking of the situation right now in the Middle East and how really challenging that is.
And a lot of it, I think back to it. It's such a time warp. But when I was in high school, one of the big things, the tensions in Ireland were
Oh, yeah,
really big.
remember that?
And so what they would do is they would bring high school kids over and have Protestant kids stay with Catholic
Yeah,
families
right.
and vice versa. And you think, well, that seems kind of simplistic and silly, but back then, and it would be the same. And it's just when we spend time with each other.
Right. Instead of making the other person the other,
Right.
you get to know them and you share
And it just
stories and you
becomes
realize
a-
I always think of Maya Angelou's poem, we are more alike, my friend, than we are unalike.
Like, yeah.
And
Yeah. And that's why I mean, I think there's a huge call and opportunity in ecumenical things
mhm.
between churches, between faiths. I
Right.
love that ecumenical prayer breakfast,
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
you know,
Isn't that like
because
next
it's
week
soon,
or
it's
the-
in October, yeah. Because October is flying by. I'm like, it's the end of October,
know,
but
really.
oh, we're already like halfway. Because look, we want the same things.
Right.
Why are we not
His love of Whole Foods.
working together? And a lot of
Because
it
we're looking at each other like the first parable, but but that one has more, or I deserve this, or
just,
yeah. Mhm.
fear or whatever. I mean, a lot of times fear separates. Somehow deep down, you're like, well, I don't know.
Lindsay, Paris Lopez wrote something that I thought was interesting in terms of the Jewish Palestinian thing, because I'd really never thought that much about the fact that Israel is populated by people who basically went through, or descendants of people who went through the Holocaust and were the object of genocide. And then they're practicing that same thing on the Palestinians and not realizing that we all want the same thing. We all want a place, and we all,
yeah,
but
it's
yeah, it's complicated. So,
anyways,
well, thank you, Shara.
yeah, so
thank
come
you.
join us if you're listening on YouTube.
Yeah, yes. Next week we'll be looking at some more parables, and should be fun.
Yeah. Good. All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Laura.
Have a great day.